Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Crouch. This is the Public Affairs Roundtable that's brought to you each month by the Williamson County Chamber. We're glad to have you with us and hope you will be thinking of questions that you want to ask toward the end of the show, because we will save some time for that. This morning, I'd like to start with a moment of silence. Williamson County has lost two of our longtime public servants, County Commissioner John Hancock and County Commissioner Doug Langston this week. We buried both of them earlier this week. And our neighbors down in Chattanooga have had a tragedy that I think has gripped our hearts as well as just about everybody in this country. And I'd like to just have a moment of silence and say a prayer for them if you feel led, and we'll move on after that. Thank you very much. This morning we have a very special guest with us, our Congressman from the 7th District, Congressman Marsha Blackburn. And Marsha, we're very happy to have you with us. Look forward to digging into the issues of Washington a little bit deeper than we're able to in other formats. Matt Largen this morning will be helping ask questions. Matt is the CEO of our Williamson Chamber and our fearless leader. And Matt, we're glad to have you with us this morning too.
Thank you.
Back just for a moment, Marsha, to the tragedy down in Chattanooga. What have we learned about that? Have we learned any lessons? Is there anything that's come out of that we need to?
Well, there are a couple of things that have come out of that. What you will see is a pushing forward of changing on the rule to allow military personnel in uniform to carry a sidearm. And you're going to see this done through the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, that we were completed. And here's the reason why, going ahead and pushing that forward. This is not the first time that we have had this type of attack. It was the 21st time over the past 10 years that we have seen this type attack. Everybody remembers the Carlos Bledsoe attack over in Little Rock, the Fort Hood attack, and what had happened in '92, there was a change of the rule from the Pentagon that disallowed the military personnel in uniform on U.S. soil to carry a sidearm. And they had decided that was the better way to handle it. The commanders thought at the recruiting stations, they didn't want them to be armed. They wanted those recruiting stations to have the doors open and allow people to come in and visit with them. What they will do is return to the commander the ability to make that decision. And that's the way, this was something the Joint Chiefs of Staff could and should take up, in a rule that should be changed. Now, after the Fort Hood shooting, we had a couple of members who pushed forward immediately with trying to change that rule and have been doing that ever since that attack. And so this, with Chattanooga, really pushed it forward. The sense of the House is that the restriction should be lifted and the flexibility should be restored, and we anticipate that very soon you will see the language, the memorandum coming out of the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs to make that change.
That has been a mystery to me all along.
Yeah.
I think most of these mass shootings have occurred where the shooter almost certainly knew nobody else would have a gun. I mean,
Yeah.
let's think about it. Now, another area of national security that I know you're concerned about is the deal that Secretary of State John Kerry just made with Iran. What number one, is that going to pass? And if
Well-
so, what effect is that going to have on us?
The Iran deal is a really bad and troublesome deal on a lot of different fronts. We have 60 days to review and weigh in on this. Having that 60-day period is very good for us. The president cannot lift the sanctions during that period of time. When we go back in September toward the end of the 60-day period, both chambers will take their vote as to whether to affirm or deny that. In the House, it is not going to pass. As a matter of fact, I think we are very close to having a veto-proof majority for disapproval of the Iran deal. And if we disapprove of that deal, the president cannot participate in lifting those sanctions. And he has to return the bill with his veto to the House and Senate. And then we move forward with the veto override. The reason it is so important that we hold the key on this with the sanctions, and I'll talk about other portions of the bill, but specifically on the sanctions, when you look at the amount of money that Iran has in U.S. Financial institutions or U.S. debt that they are holding, things of that nature. And then what you know is if we do not release that money and if we continue our sanctions, then it makes it more difficult for them for other portions, dealing with other portions of the world, because we still are the ones who have their money restricted. So keeping those sanctions are important. The sanctions were working. We have absolutely no idea why this administration would have agreed to such a terrible deal for the United States. And I have had the opportunity to meet a couple of times with the Israeli ambassador, Ambassador Dermer. And the ambassador is very concerned about that. When you look at it from the geopolitical situations with what would happen in the Middle East, you know that Israel is going to protect themselves. You also know that the Saudis have said they would respond with hot lead. People are not going to sit there and let Iran have a nuclear weapon and not be able to protect themselves. So a concern is over the arms race that it would incent in that region. Another thing is lifting the arms embargo. It came as a complete surprise to everyone that ballistic missiles were included in this arms embargo. It had not been listed as an item on the agenda. It was not listed in the summary, and then you get the text and you see that they have not only are looking at a 5-year restriction on arms, but also on ballistic missiles. The other component of concern are the side deals that the IAEA, which is the Atomic Energy Commission, they have side deals that we have not seen, but yet we're supposed to be a party to the overall deal. And this deals with the inspections that will be carried out in Iran. Now, Iran has been on a very fast ramp up when it comes to moving toward nuclear power or nuclear enrichment. And under this deal, they are going to be able to keep 5,060 of their 19,000 centrifuges. That's a lot. And you look back a few years ago and they only had 300. So this is one of the points of concern. And the way this deal is structured, 10 years down the road, when some of these restrictions are coming off, what will have happened is Iran will be able to do their R&D this entire time. So you leave them with their centrifuges, you leave them with their water power, you leave them with the ability to hold uranium and the ability to do R&D. So this agreement is something that more or less sets a time certain that Iran will be able to move to nuclear power rather than prohibiting them from moving toward a nuclear weapon. It is an incredibly troubling deal. We are working during the month of August to be certain that we can build that veto-proof majority and prohibit this from moving forward.
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for being here. We certainly
Sure.
appreciate it. I'm going to just kind of take a step back and ask some questions that really get at the context of what you're dealing with in Washington
Sure.
these days. So first, what's the overall mood in Washington, and what shift have you seen, say, in the last year?
Well, the mood in Washington is pretty much the administration has what they want to do, and they try to do it through executive orders. And then you've got the House and the Senate that keep working to get things done. The House has been much more bipartisan and has moved forward on much more legislation than we have seen move out of the Senate yet this year. And I think you will continue to see that happen. Our committee, where I serve as vice chair, Energy and Commerce Committee, we've done a couple of things that are bipartisan bills that are moving forward. One is the SGR fix, which deals with Medicare and getting money to doctors. That was worked out in a bipartisan manner, and we were able to accomplish that. Another that we have done is a bill called 21st Century Cures, and that deals with precision medicine, 21st century medicine, very important to those that work fighting chronic diseases, rare diseases, and very important to the biotherapies and the type work that is done over in Cool Springs at the Life Science Center. We've gotten that out. We also did the Toxic Substance Reform Act. Again, something for those that are dealing in manufacturing, working with chemicals and components. We were able to get that done. The Chamber of Commerce was, on a national basis, very supportive and wanted us to push this across the finish line. We were able to get it done. It helps with keeping jobs here in the U.S. So those are some of the things that we at our committee have done. I think there's a tremendous amount of frustration that is in D.C. We all have it. The administration just makes up their mind about something and wants to circumvent Congress, thereby circumventing the input of the people. And we're forever having to go back in then and look at some of the rules and regulations that they just pass because they want to, and they will say they do it because they can. And then we have to go in legislatively and disallow those actions. So it's kind of a combative type atmosphere. The House will be a bit combative with the administration, but everybody is or with the Senate, and everybody's combative with the administration because of the overreach that they exercise.
So that leads into the next question, and I love to ask these kind of philosophical questions too, because I think it does really help explain how the different parties fall in position. So, you know, I ask this usually when we get a chance to talk to you. What do you think is the biggest philosophical divide between the two parties, and do you think at this point it can be defined in a single issue?
Probably the biggest philosophical divide is how much power should government have? And should it be captured in Washington, D.C., or should it be sent back to the states and local governments? And of course, you all know what side I'm on on that, because I want state and local governments and citizens to be able to hold that power. I think vesting more power in Washington, D.C., which is further removed, is the wrong place to put it. I much prefer for the county commission to make a decision of what to do with federal funds, or whether or not to seek a federal grant, or what type project they want to move forward on, rather than having the federal government and some bureaucrat in a building in Washington who has never set foot in Williamson County make that decision. So that's probably the biggest philosophical divide that there is who holds the power. And I do not want unelected, unappointed, unaccountable bureaucrats sitting there in offices who do not want to drill down and do the heavy lift. I do not want them making decisions for our local counties and for our states.
Thank you, Dave.
That makes sense. If anybody's got a fly swatter in the room,
We've got one up here.
we would appreciate having it up here momentarily, but we're trying not to let it distract us too much. Marsha, I think one of the issues that's pretty much at the top of everyone's mind in Williamson County is traffic.
Yes.
And as I understand it, the transportation bill expires today. And so after today, unless something happens very quickly, the funding for all the federal money for roads is gone. What tell us what's happening?
What we did was a 3-month extension and the Senate took it up. The Senate said they were not going to do anything but their 6-year bill, which was this big bloated not paid for bill. And we in the House had said, no, we're not going to do that. It's inappropriate. But we have done a 3-month extension. Included in this extension is some of the veterans money and veterans programs that we have been trying to get the Senate to take up, and they would not. So HSAs for veterans, one of those bills. So anyway, that will allow the programs to continue for 3 months. Now, as we look at a long-term bill, which, yes, we need to get that done, there is a difference of opinion between the House and the Senate as to how this should be constructed. In the House, we are more given to surface transportation and having those dollars work with our local and state officials. The Senate is more into keeping the enhancements and putting more money into mass transit, things of that nature. So you've got different ways of looking at this. I feel like local communities and states know their traffic problems, and they're the ones that need to be able to make that direction. When I was in the state Senate and then when I went to Congress, one of the first amendments I filed was to get rid of the enhancement dollars that are mandated that you use for walking trails and bike paths, things of that nature, and allow state DOTs to decide how to use those funds. In Tennessee, bridge work is what we need a lot of. And there are other ways to use that. Plus, in Tennessee, we do not bond our roads. When we lay asphalt, or pour concrete, we've paid for it. And that's a big difference. You've got a lot of states out there that accrue and carry a tremendous amount of road debt, and we don't do that here. So there needs to be the ability to say, we don't want bike paths, passive parks, hiking trails. We're going to put all of that money into transportation of one type or another. Also, there needs to be the flexibility for entities to look at light rail and to look at transportation, public transportation or mass transit that will fit their needs. Around here, and I know, how many of you are working? I saw Rogers come through, and I know he and Diane, I know Matt is working with the regional transportation group to look at some of those issues. And what you need is flexibility. You don't need a mandate and a dictate from Washington that says you've got to do it this way or it's not going to happen. And that probably is what's going to be the difference between how the House and Senate approach that bill.
Any chance for a increase in the gas tax to actually give us
No.
money to do things?
No, there is not a chance for a gas tax increase. I do not see that happening. I think that what you will begin to see is looking at miles driven, and maybe some of the states will begin to look at that as opposed to simple utilization of a gas tax, and especially miles driven when it comes to commercial and heavy haul.
Thank you.
Sure. Let me kind of set up this next round of questioning and let you decide which topic you want to tackle, Congressman.
Sure.
But we had a chance to have a CEO roundtable with about 15 CEOs from the national region last week, and we started the conversation by saying, what are your biggest issues? And they started by talking about cybersecurity,
Yeah.
and how their hijacked emails are happening now at least once a week. They talked about the demonization of corporate America, and really more than anything, they talked about, in their words, regulation overkill. And every single CEO had a story, all the way from the new rules for mortgages through the banks, asked the question, who does the EPA actually report to? And it, all the way down to the National Transportation Safety Board about recall notices on cars that in the past would have just been a service order, now recalling the entire vehicle. So I'd love for you to address any of those ones you'd like to.
Let's start with cyber.
Okay.
I think that's a great place to begin the conversation. And I have chaired the Data Security and Privacy Working Group for over 2 years in Congress. We have a data security bill that is ready to move forward. It is a bipartisan bill. It has come out of our telecommunications subcommittee at the Energy and Commerce Committee. We oversee telecommunications and the internet. The cybersecurity issue is huge. And the reason it is so important to our business community, and the reason we've got to pass my data security bill and get a standard on the books, is because 2014 was the year of the breach. You have seen cyber attacks on our businesses and our critical infrastructure increase over 6,000% in the last 5 years. Think about that. Our critical infrastructure gets hit thousands of times a day. Thousands. And this is not something that is going to diminish. And we have an employer, a large employer here in Williamson County, that this year had a cyber attack and had a hacking, and 4.5 million healthcare records were pulled out of a system. And the reason we have to change a couple of things is because you've got to, number one, be able to share information. Your private sector has got to be able to share it with the government and with like businesses, whether it's retail, whether it is banking, and say, we've got a bad actor in the system and here's the algorithm. And be able to identify this. So that's a liability issue. The liability issue is something that we will address. The second change that needs to be done is on having data security standards and breach notification. 2014 dubbed the year of the breach. And it is something that is not going to get less, it is going to increase. And as we have chaired this working group, one of the things we've talked about is consumer awareness and having people who utilize your sites know how to protect themselves and how to set their security standards. When we have one company that a contractor to this company was on a website, a rogue website. Most of your rogue financial networks are out of Russia. Your rogue sites are housed out of China. And they had gotten on that. The spyware, malware got onto their system there. Then this system logged into the secure system that was in existence. It was not a closed system like you would have with a utility, but an enterprise system. And so you have the malware jump in. It lived in that system for 9 months. And then it exported all of the several million databases and moved them to another enterprise system, completely separate from one company, and then exited the country with this information. This is how these work. So you've got to have breach notification to let people know when something takes place. The reason we have to do it now is quite simply this: the Internet of Things. And you are having items by the thousand come on to the broadband system and the internet system. Cisco estimates that by the time we get to the end of this decade, by the time we get to 2020, we are going to have 50 billion, with a B, 50 billion devices attached to the internet. And as you look at the Internet of Things now comprising automobiles, which are basically rolling computers, and you look at the use in restaurants, you look at the way devices are used to incent point of purchase with stores and shops, and the way people now connect their appliances, their home security systems. All of this requires that we do something on data security and on cyber security, so that whether it is a web-based system, whether it's an enterprise system or a closed system, you know that there are certain protections there. The cost of hacks and cyber attacks to business is running into the hundreds of millions of dollars every year. So it doesn't surprise me that that is one of the top items that the CEO Roundtable would seek to address. You want to move on to regulation?
Sure.
EPA?
Yeah. Yes, please.
The cost of regulation and compliance increases. I have companies that I meet with, and I'll ask them, what's the regulatory burden that they're looking at right now? And they will tell you that one of the top things there is the cost of increased regulation, things such as the EPA, which, if you talk about something that has shut down more factories in the state of Tennessee, it is probably the EPA. And the way they go in and audit and fine people, the way they disallow the use, try to rework how people are working. The overreach there also extends to things like the waters of the U.S., the rule that they are seeking to pass, which infringes on private property rights, and the cost to our cities and counties from the EPA with runoff water, the requirements that they make. All of that adds to the tax burden. It also adds to the cost of doing business. We had a stat at Energy and Commerce. We have a subcommittee, Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade, and we were looking at the cost of the regulatory burden to a car, and I think that to a U.S.-made automobile now, it's about $2,000. That is direct cost of specific regulations that add to the cost, the manufacturing cost of that car. Just from new regulations, we had over 70,000 pages of rules and regulations that hit the books last year, federal rules and regulations, and a large majority of those were through the EPA. And I think another concern for our electric power utilities and for our manufacturers, our industrial users, is the cost of electricity and power generation. And the fact that the EPA and this administration has truly had a war on coal. And in our region of the world, that drives up the cost of energy production. Solar is not effective here. We don't get enough heat units per day for solar to be effective. Wind energy is not effective. We do not have what we need for wind. I was over at TVA and working one day and looking at the boards, and if you're not able to get even a megawatt on what should be one of the best days of the year as far as wind energy goes, it's not working. Hydroelectric works, coal works, nuclear works, and that is where we need to have the opportunity to utilize those as renewable sources or as carbon sources. And this cost of increase to electric power and electric power generation is not helpful to keeping jobs here.
Let me follow that up with one final question before I turn it back over to Dave. The president has proposed new overtime rules for managers. What's the odds of that actually passing?
I think that is very troublesome, and I've talked to employers who say, what they want is what's going to end up being best for their employee. They need the ability to hire and train and then move people up the ladder without feeling like everybody has to be subject to the overtime provisions. Plus, the other concern is what it does to flex arrangements that employers have with employees who want the ability to adjust their hours, work different hours, have a different working arrangement so that they can work with children or elderly relatives that they're trying to care for. So those have not been warmly received.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Switch gears here and talk about one of the most important issues in this county, which is education.
Sure.
Our educational system here has been extremely beneficial to our businesses and our families. And there's apparently a move on in Congress to rewrite the No Child Left Behind law.
Absolutely.
Where is that? What's the difference between the House, the Senate initiatives
Yeah,
there?
and the difference is this. The bill was moving forward, and then due to lack of support, it was pulled from the floor in March. And what we were able to do was to pass some things that put more of give your states and your counties more options. And that is something that needs to be done. I am not a supporter of Common Core. And so we were able to get an amendment on the bill that allows states and counties and local school districts to opt out of Common Core and to not be penalized and see a restriction of funds. That would allow bills, I think Glenn Cassida, and by the way, our state legislative delegation does a fabulous job, as does our county government. We love being a part of the team in addressing the needs. But the amendment we got on would allow bills like Glenn's bill and what the state legislature passed to be exercised and no restriction or diminishment of federal funds to be there. We also were able to get an amendment on to the House version of the bill, which will allow you to change your testing, and allow parents to take their children out of some of this testing, which we think that's something that should be. I think Tennessee is testing 45 days a year, and that is a tremendous number of days that go into testing and not into instruction. And that should concern every single one of us. We also were able to get an amendment on that would require attention to preserving the privacy of children. And we're going to do more work. I will be involved in the additional piece that we will do. There's a bill called FERPA, which covers the privacy concerns, and that will come up for a rewrite. And what we will do is disallow school districts to sell this information. We will look at how they capture, how they hold it, how long they can hold it, for what purpose it can be used, require anonymization, but make some substantial changes in those provisions. The Senate bill and the House bill is more conservative. If those provisions that I mentioned are not included in the final bill, I don't see it getting through the House. We were pleased in the House version of the bill to end 65 federal programs to end the education waivers that President Obama has given, which we see as the administration's way of picking winners and losers. And we wanted to end that, and we expect all of those things to be in the final version of the bill in order for it to pass the House.
Now, Senator Lamar Alexander, he's chairman of the Senate Education Committee, and he's apparently proposing what sounds to me like vouchers so that kids and their parents can take the federal dollars that are allocated to them and move to other schools. I think his proposal is for other public schools, but what's your thoughts about vouchers and
Well, there again, it is flexibility that allows the money to follow the child, and instead of the money going to the state. And as you look at the option that is on the table for beginning to block grant dollars back to the states and diminish the importance of the federal Department of Education, you're going to hear more about that and allowing the children to utilize that and move to different schools. As there are more charter schools that come into play, you will see more for this, so that the parents have the option and so that local school systems have more options.
there are probably people in this room on both sides of that issue,
Sure.
and I'd love to dig into it a lot deeper, but in the interest of time, we'll move on. But the voucher issue, I'm sure, is going to be very well discussed over the next few months. Matt?
Sure. On July 23rd, through your Twitter feed, Congressman, you asked for stories about how Obamacare has affected the bottom line of businesses.
Right.
What did you hear, and what did you learn from that discussion?
You know, one of the things that we saw from that and what we got, and it was so interesting, Matt, not everything came back to us on Twitter. We had a lot of people that actually wrote an email and sent an email in talking about that. The effect on businesses has been, we heard from people who had not gone, had not hired. We heard from people that they didn't want to butt up against the 50 employee cap. We had people that had moved people to under 30 hours and were watching very carefully how they approach that 30-hour workload. I even heard from some school districts who said, you know, one of the things that it had affected with them was how they utilize substitute teachers, because they can only work so many hours, so many days, and it's not just working different sites, it is for the system as a whole. And it was really interesting to see that what this has done is to require people to approach in a different way, whether it's the number of employees that they hire and the number of hours they work, or the ability to use additional work and utilize part-time work. So it was amazing to us that what they said to us was the impact is basically negative because it caps opportunities for individuals and for employees. That was the big lesson out of that. It caps their opportunities because you've got this mandate over here and you've got employers that are having to say, we've got to work under this. So how do we organize our business and our entities or our locations so we're not hitting that cap? The other thing that we heard was the cost of insurance. And looking at the escalation in the cost of insurance is just something. We had people that were writing to us. We had increases that had gone from, I think we had a 7% increase and a 36% increase in the cost of insurance. And if you are an employer and your insurance rates are going up 36%, on top of having gone up 21% last year, you're looking at a big chunk of change. And it affects what you are able to do with dealing with your employees. So we have looked at it from both sides, the human capital side and then the actual cost on the ledger.
And this is probably a good time to mention, if you're not following the Congressman on Twitter, you should. It's at Marsha Blackburn.
There you go.
If you do it, you will join nearly 18,000 other people that have
right.
followed you. And you do, I mean, just following your Twitter feed just for a couple days, you can see how you take leadership positions on the issues that are really affecting us. So it's great if you're not following it. And let me follow up on that.
Can I say one
Sure.
thing there? If you follow us on Twitter and Facebook, when we're doing some of these hearings at Energy and Commerce, like the healthcare hearings or some of our oversight hearings on these federal agencies, like the EPA or the FTC, CDC, CMS, any of the acronym bunch, then we tweet and Facebook the live links to those hearings, and you can stream that hearing.
It's amazing how well you and your staff make use of technology. And so this will probably be my final question. As father of two daughters, I noticed on an Instagram post last week you had a chance to visit with Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, who talked about women leading in the workforce. What did you take away from that conversation with her?
Well, she has been in to see us a couple of times, and I was included in some of her writings where she profiled, utilized some stories from women. She's a no excuses sort of gal. She gets in and rolls up her sleeve and gets to work. But we had talked some last week about how still it is, there is still a gender bias, if you will, when it comes to corporations and the C-suite and corporate boards, corporate governance, things of that nature. So we looked at that a little bit. Those numbers are not changing the way they should be or at the pace you see them changing for mid-level management jobs. And so that's still, and corporate policies will change when there are more women that are sitting at the table to make those changes.
Great, thanks. And let me just say, I mean, things that you do now and Ms. Sandberg does now are really going to open opportunities for people like me whose daughters will eventually enter the workforce. So thank you for that,
Absolutely, and we
Congressman.
hope we do a little trailblazing.
Absolutely, thank you.
Matt, you've almost convinced me I'm going to have to investigate Twitter, so
It'll be good for you.
That's right.
Get into
Yeah.
the 21st century.
It gives the impression you're working all the time.
Great. It's time for our audience to step up to the podium and ask their questions. If you would begin to make your way forward, we would like to hear from you. While you're doing that,
Let's recognize Steve Albrooks,
Steve
who
is
is in our Franklin office, and he's here this morning. And anybody that has questions or wants to come by the courthouse and see us, Steve is right there.
Steve is Marsha's presence right here in Franklin, and we use him regularly. Now, I asked the Congressman earlier if she wanted to make any announcements. According to USA Today, we have another presidential candidate in the GOP race this morning.
We're at 17.
Yeah, we could make it 18 if you would like.
No, thank you.
The,
It is an honor to represent you, and I love what I do. I don't care to get in that race. Yeah.
Just make it more interesting.
Yep,
So,
there you go. It would be that.
Now, our audience is shy. I would hate to have to start calling on folks. Thank you, Gary Buchanan.
Gary.
Marsha,
Yes, sir.
Dave stole my thunder. By the way, I'm Gary Buchanan. I was going to ask you why you don't run for president, but I'm going to move on.
Okay.
I heard your comment. Marsha, I get concerned as a resident of the United States, and I'll use a crude term, the gutting of the military
Yeah.
establishment that's going on in this country. Russia, China's building islands for military purposes. On Fox News just a few weeks ago, it was about a 15-second blip that Russian bombers were buzzing California. And it was just on for about 15 seconds. I understand budgets, but would you comment
Sure.
on what you all can do on the Hill to stop, again, what I consider to be the gutting of our military defense? Thank
Yeah.
you.
I appreciate that question, and I represent Energy and Commerce on the Budget Committee. They decided to give us a seat on the committee a couple of years ago because we handle energy, we handle telecommunications and the internet, which the cyber comes into that. We handle health care, so all of the Obamacare, Affordable Care Act provisions are things we have to see. And this year, Gary, I was successful in getting the only amendment that was allowed onto the budget document on the budget document. And what it did was to establish a defense readiness deficit neutral reserve fund. This is a fund that as we claw back money from other agencies in the discretionary portion of the budget, we are moving that money into that fund for the military to use. We've done that because the Budget Control Act with the budget caps, that was passed in 2011, everybody got a 2% cut except the military. The president wanted 5% cut on them. That is something they cannot meet their mission and do that. When you look at the cyber attacks, when you look at the hot spots we've got around the world, when you look at China with the Blue Water Navy that they are building up, you have to have a way to reprogram some of this money and get it to them. I'll give you an example. Fort Campbell, which is in our district, and I am up there regularly and working with the command team there. They had reduced, DOD had reduced the amount of money that Fort Campbell had for the flying hours program. Well, what does the 101st do? They fly. So every year, for the last 3 years, I've had to go back in and make a special request to get that money for the flying hours program, because if they don't meet their redeployment training hours, guess what? They can't fly when they're deployed. See, it makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. Plus, working over in the Mideast, the wear and tear on the choppers is so much more. Our aviation assets just take a beating because of the sand, and it costs more for the readiness. So I was successful in getting this fund up. We have put the money into it to keep it moving forward. I have gone into the Inspector General reports for the last 4 years to identify waste in agencies. This was a project we did in our office with our interns. And we have been able to quantify $105.7 billion of waste that the Inspector General has pointed out to these agencies, and they hadn't done anything about it. So what Congressman Price, who chairs budget, and I are doing are hearings where we're going to bring in agency head and the Inspector General and get to the bottom of this. And if these agencies have not cleaned their act up, we're going to ding them and disallow that portion, $1 billion maybe, and move it over so that we've got money that we can utilize to stop this gutting of the military and to weaken them. So that's the approach that we're taking. You know, I just got tired of the issue being there and nothing being done about it, so we did something about it that's tangible.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
Good morning, Chuck Moyer.
Yes.
Marsha, you and I have had the opportunity to talk about small business, transportation, particularly the independent contractor business model.
Yeah.
We've talked this morning a lot about the frustration from a business perspective, job creation standpoint, and what's going on the Hill. For example, earlier this year in May, House Bill 4611, Senate Bill 1687, both dealing with small business, worker classification, both died. Then Eric Paulson introduced H.R. 2483 that kind of revises the IRS code and gives definition, which is viewed as a good thing. 2 weeks ago, Department of Labor came out with guidelines that no one approved. Wage and labor
Right.
committees are against, or at least feel are too stringent. It's obvious that the guidelines are biased to the administration's opinion.
Exactly.
Does HR 427 help that? In the short run, how can small businesses deal with guidelines versus laws and regulations? And in the long term, what's the right path to correct that?
Well, the long term, the right path to correct it is to have this administration's time come to an end and get a new president and a new administration that is going to be more business friendly, and we look forward to that. I find it so interesting that the term now is gig economy. And of course, we in Nashville understand that. Because everybody gets a gig. Sometimes gigs run into long-term projects, and those projects turn into careers. Let me ask you this. How many of you in the room use independent contractors or part-time employees? I want to see your hands. Look at that. See, this is what the Department of Labor does not understand, and I think that as you look at the discussion that is taking place across the country, Hillary Clinton has shown she does not understand that. They would like for everybody to have employment that would be a 40-hour work week and no more, and for a set amount of money. And if that money doesn't hit a certain bar, then you've got to start to pay overtime. So they would institutionalize that and take that flexibility away from an employer who says, I want to bulk up something, I want to do a project, I want to do independent contractors. You know, now Dave and I went out and sold books and worked our way through college.
You
And
sold a lot more than I did.
I did outsell you. I sold a whole lot more than you did.
I'm afraid you're exactly right.
There you go. But see, we understand the doors that it opens up for somebody to be able to be an independent contractor and to work with a larger entity and to learn from that. What we have right now is people who primarily are academics that think theoretically it should work this way and everybody should fit in their queue. And I think that as you look at millennials and the entrepreneurial society that is there, that we're moving to the other end. You're giving me the wrap-up sign.
Unfortunately, we're nearing the end of our show. We're not going to have time for that next question. I am so sorry. The exciting thing this morning is that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has asked us to allow a little time for them to give you an award. And so we'd like to take the last couple of minutes here and bring up more Hallmark from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And Marsha, if you would join
Sure.
him out there in front of the podium where the cameras can see you more.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, Matt and Dave, let me just say thank you for the invitation and opportunity to be here today. Congressman, thank you for being here as well.
Yes.
On behalf of the United States Chamber of Commerce, it is a pleasure for me to be here to recognize Congresswoman Blackburn for not only being a good friend of business here in the great state of Tennessee, but for our entire country. As some of you may or may not know, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the world's largest business federation. We represent more than 3 million businesses of every size, sector, and region, including state and local chambers of commerce. Every year, we poll the American business community to find out what are the issues most important to you on a day-to-day basis, and then we evaluate the members of Congress on how they vote on those issues. For the members who vote 70% or greater in that given year of Congress receives the Chamber's coveted Spirit of Enterprise Award. Last year, for the second session of the 113th Congress, I'm sorry. I'm not supposed to, how I'm supposed to do this with this
I don't know.
mic here,
We'll-
but
we'll
anyway,
just-
we'll lean, how about that? Sorry about that. But anyway, for the second session of the 113th Congress, the U.S. Chamber designated just 14 votes out of the hundreds taken on the House floor, some of the most important votes in that session of Congress. Some of those issues include transportation, trade, energy development, and regulatory reform legislation. I'm proud to tell you that once again, Congresswoman Blackburn once again earned the Spirit of Enterprise Award and now has a cumulative voting record with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce of 88% for her entire time in Congress. So Congresswoman Blackburn, on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Tennessee Chamber, which are represented here today, and the Williamson Inc. Chamber and all their members here today, it's my pleasure to present you with the Spirit of Enterprise Award. Thank you for your leadership in Washington. Thank you so much. Can we get a couple of quick pictures? Matt, do you want to come get a picture?
Yeah, sure.
I apologize. Apparently, I wasn't speaking into the microphone, which is in my shoulder back here. So,
While they're taking pictures, I'm going to go ahead and thank the Vanderbilt University Office of Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations. Lynn Maddox is a big supporter of our show, and they help underwrite some of the Chamber's costs here. I want to thank Newt Danley and his team from TV3 WCTV for making this possible. It wouldn't happen without them, and anytime you see Newt, just give him a pat on the back for all they do for the Chamber and for this show. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Chamber staff that works so hard to make sure you all are here, number one, and have coffee and things to go with it. Cindy, thank you, and Verlinda for making that possible. Matt?
Yeah, and I just want to thank you, Congressman, for taking the time to do this. And it's amazing the preparation and the time and effort you put into this and the way you serve your constituents. We've got notes laid out here, Dave and I, and you come without notes. And that just shows how serious you take this and how well you represent our district, and we appreciate it. And we spent almost an hour and didn't even mention Donald Trump. And that's probably the first time that's happened to an interview with you in a long, long time. So thank you. Thank you for that, Congressman.
Thank you for being with us, Congressman, and we appreciate all of you in the audience for being here. Hope you'll come back next month, and that will conclude our show this morning. Thank you very much.
Awesome. That's funny.
It's serious
You're
news.
right.
It's serious news.
Mics are off, guys. You can talk.
Thank you. That was great.
Marsha, thank you so much. Ma'am.
To my home.
Goodness.
Hey,
Been
how are
busy.
you? Good to see you.
Oh, it's been crazy.
Hey, lady, come around.
That was great. Well done.
What a great way to get some exercise and spend time with your family. Hi, I'm Steve Hayslip.
And I'm his son, Paul Hayslip.
And today we're going to show you some rules of the road that you may not have thought about that apply to bike riders. Let's go. That's good. Good pace. On narrow roads like this, cyclists should leave at least 2 car lengths in between riders. That way the cars have room to get in between the cyclists and pass them individually. You take the lead. Stay to the right. When approaching a stop sign or a traffic light, if a car and cycle are arriving at the same time, the car needs to stay back just a bit, allowing the cyclist room to move in front into the turn lane. This allows the cyclist to turn left safely. If the lane is too narrow, or if the cyclists are traveling pretty much the same speed as traffic, then the cyclists have the right to come out and take the lane.
Just remember that everyone has a right to the roadway. It is a public road, but everyone has to observe the rules of the road. They apply to the motorists and the bicyclists alike.
Well, those are just some of the rules. Mainly, stay safe and have fun. And most of all,
Enjoy the ride.